Hello and welcome to the 2024 R1 feature review for the construction and field service applications. As we know, construction involves many different roles. We go from job site operations, back office operations, on-site support from equipment and purchasing, as well as then having your construction executives and those who might need to see additional information around the construction industry. So within the construction edition itself, we handle multiple roles and the different aspects of what employees do during the day regarding construction and project management. And we're going to talk about some of those roles and how we've improved and enhanced the offerings to help people with their day-to-day operations within Acumatica. For 24R1, there's a couple of key items that I'd like to go through today. One being the ability to link the accounts payable transaction to a pro forma bill, the ability for the negative expense receipt capture with a corporate card, some things that we've done from a usability perspective around simplifying the pro forma correction workflow, the ability to track more compliance information as you're doing maybe insurance certificates, as well as what we've done with multi-currency situations and some additional defaulting that helps within the visibility and the transaction information related to the projects. And I'll show you something we've done on the mobile app and the general experience. And then field service, we'll talk about some things as we're looking at it, what field service means to customers and how they're doing things within Acumatica. With 24R1, we continue additional architectural improvements as we're looking at the underlying application and how we can help our customers. And then you'll see how we're working through it and simplifying the credit memo creation and application for those field service invoices. So let's take a look at enhanced functionality, things that we've added with 24R1. And we'll start off with the accounts payable document link inside of Proforma, and then we'll review the expense refunds. For the Proforma enhancements, I'd like to take you through it and just talk about the project billing workflow in general. Now, as you're getting ready to bill for a construction project, the work is completed. Well, then the accounts payable bill is received for that work performed. So maybe they're subcontractors, the framers or the electricians are now sending the invoices in for the work they've completed. Well, as you're looking at now doing the bill to the customer, you review the project expenses, see what can get billed in this period. Then you generate the invoice to the owner or the customer, maybe an AIA document, a G702 or 703. And then you might need to provide the details of those expenses that you're billing for as backup and substantiate the invoice that you've just presented to your customer. Well, then as that flow continues on, now you receive payment from the customer and the owner. Well, now in situations where you were billed by your subcontractor for an expense, now you want to be able to pay those bills because you've gotten paid by your customer. So you want to have an easy way to see the expenses related to the invoice that was just paid and then simply make those accounts payable payments to the appropriate vendors. Well, prior to 24R1, if you think of that workflow of pay when paid, or now as you're getting and you're assembling the customer invoices for the costs incurred on the project and what you need to do to justify the amount that you're billing. Well, those amounts can come from many different areas. Specifically, if they come from a subcontractor, part of your agreement with that subcontractor may be that, well, the subcontractor gets paid when you get paid, otherwise known as pay when paid. And then from cash flow purposes, this allows contractors to receive the funds from their clients prior to paying the sub-tier contractors and reducing the overall risk and helping with cash flow as you're running and organizing your businesses. But the ability to then link those expenses that you've incurred to the actual bill itself helps streamline the workflow and provide the information necessary for you to reconcile the bills, work the payment process, and what needs to happen. So before 24R1, you'd enter the accounts payable bill tied to the project. You generate the customer bill via the Proforma, which generates the accounts receivable invoice. The cash comes in for that invoice, and maybe you've set up a business event or a notification to alert someone that the cash came in for that bill to help streamline that workflow. But then you had to run an open AP document for the project, review what bills were tied to that specific AR invoice and Proforma, and then go ahead and select those bills for payment by project. Well, at 24R1, I'm happy to say that we've added a side panel inside of Proforma for linking that accounts payable bill to that Proforma invoice. As you can see on the screen, you have the pro forma entry, the side panel, it says linked cost transactions. Now you start to add those cost transactions, and you start to accumulate and build what transactions are tied to either the individual pro forma line itself or the overall pro forma. And now you can bring all those expenses together to help substantiate the bill and then make the pay when paid workflow even easier as it's going through. Viewing and really what we're focusing in on here with 24R1 as part of that project billing workflow is how to review and mark those expenses to be billed. And now let me show you what we've done and go ahead and do a demonstration. The first thing we'll take a look at is a specific project here, the Beach Hotel and Condos. We'll look at a specific pro forma that we're creating. In this case, it's for our application number 8 and the next progress billing. You'll notice in the upper right hand corner is a function that says linked cost transactions. So this function will now tell us which AP bills we've already have associated with this particular pro forma. If I want to add any new ones, I simply hit the plus sign. It takes me to the existing project transactions that have not been linked yet, and I can easily go through and identify which transactions I want to add into this pro forma bill. So I'll just randomly pick these 3 bills that need to go back for the insurance, the windows and the doors, add that into the pro forma. Now those line items are added into this particular pro forma, and if I wanted to associate them to a specific pro forma line number, then I have the ability to say which line number does that pro forma or do these expenses relate to, and I can add that specific expense right down into that item. So in this case, I'll put the exterior paint tied to the finishes line, and that simply can come right in and now add those cost transactions into the overall pro forma, or in this case I'll blank this out and say the specific pro forma in general. What are those line numbers? Even giving me the possibility to look at the specific invoice information. If I have the attachment related to that transaction, being able to see that invoice or see that transaction tied right into that activity. This allows me to see the linked transactions for the specific pro forma, and now when that pro forma might get paid, I'm going to prepare payments. I can go in and possibly add an activity right in prepare payments to go out and look at the pro forma costs, call up that same project and that same pro forma information. So that was pro forma 56. Now it shows me which activities or which cost items are on that pro forma, and now I can decide which ones do I want to pay as it relates to that accounts payable bill right back into the pro forma, helping me with that payment process. Now that we've seen the demonstration of what's in 24R1, let's review back and think about the project billing workflow and the improvements. Well, at 24R1, we've now linked the expense to that invoice. What does that allow us to do in future releases? We'll now update the substantiated billing reports and documents that we have tied to that pro forma invoicing. So in future releases, look to have the exact expense tied to the substantiated bill, the images associated with it. So more things coming with substantiated billing. And then how additional ways we can help with the automation of the pay when paid. Right now, if you think about it, and what you saw in the demonstration is you can add that side panel to other areas inside of Acumatica, so you can simply see the expenses that were tied to the pro forma invoice and the accounts receivable bill, maybe inside of cash receipts or inside the accounts payable payment processing. But think about now how we can automate that and continue on within the overall process of accounts payable, the bills, the expenses, project billing, and how we can help with your day-to-day operations. Let's move along to the next item I want to discuss in 24R1, expense receipt enhancements. If you think of the expense receipt workflow, maybe on the mobile device, you're capturing those expense receipts, the corporate card is used, that information comes back, gets tied into an expense claim, and then overall reconciliation with the corporate card statement. Well, part of that issue is what happens when there's a refund or a return to one of those expenses and that was tied to the corporate card. And now you need to go out and get a credit for that return. And maybe a project manager had to visit the client site, paid for information and the hotel accommodation on the corporate card, but then that site visit got canceled or shortened, and they're now something was refunded back to the corporate card. How can you process that refund? Well, before 24R1, those expense receipts paid with the corporate card, you weren't able to process the refund or that negative expense receipt. With 24R1, I'm happy to say that a negative expense receipt can now be entered when paid with the corporate card right inside the expense receipt, and then processing within the expense claim. You'll see on the screen the negative amount, the tip amount if there is one associated with it, the tax information. So now you can enter those negative amounts to then take care of those refunds. Now that ties back into and creates the accounts payable cash return document right there from the workflow. So let's go ahead and take a look at the demonstration. So in this example, let's look at what happens if it was only a couple days less or a day less for on-site training. One of the easier ways to do the negative expense receipt is to call up an existing receipt. In this case, I've got the 3 days of training. I'll copy that. Then I'll add a new one. Simply paste in the prior activity, and in this case, make it a -1 for the individual days. You'll notice that now the amount is a negative, and we'll apply that to the same cost code. We notice it's going to the corporate card and the company expense. Now that simply, I can go ahead and reverse or subtract the day from the training, give me a $129 credit against that particular expense receipt. Go ahead and claim that receipt, and now go add those negative expenses right back into an expense claim for the negative amount. Now recording that and applying that into the corporate card. Very simple process, being able to go in and apply a credit or a refund with the expense receipt. Now tie that in for future reconciliations. So recapping what we just saw with the expense receipt improvements is that now employees can enter negative expense receipts to make a full or partial refund to the corporate card, and that allows finance to later match those expenses with the card statements when reconciling the card balance as well as what needs to be entered into the corresponding general ledger account. Let's move along to usability enhancements with 24R1. Today I'll talk about a couple of things related to pro forma corrections, compliance validation. We'll talk also about service management and some simplification around credit memos there. Let's get started. Within pro forma and the ability to correct pro forma invoices, if you think of the overall workflow, well, the progress bill gets submitted, the invoice gets reviewed. Well, there might be a question or a dispute about what is on that pro forma itself or what ends up on the invoice. This statement then requires some sort of correction and resubmission. That invoice gets corrected, and then you have new updated customer balance. Previously to 24R1, you had the ability to correct the pro forma, so that was added. But then as it did the automatic reversal of the original accounts receivable invoice corresponding to that pro forma, issued a reversing credit memo, it required users to come in and manually apply those reversing documents. If those steps weren't followed in order, or if a reversing document was removed before it was released, it might have resulted in some inconsistency with the accounts receivable invoices that were open and the prior pro forma revisions. Well, with 24R1, we've now streamlined that process to help within the corrections and the adjustment workflow. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at this particular project, Flagler Custom Home. We've generated pro forma number 24. Well, it's come back and they've identified some discrepancies or some issues with that particular bill. So let me go back up. I'm going to correct that invoice. And now as part of that individual pro forma correction, I'm coming in and identifying that We really were not completed as much as we thought with the finishes. We need to make that 90,000 instead of the 98,000. What do we need to go back and identify for this particular bill? Making that revision on the identified line item. And as we go ahead and remove that hold, let's take a look at the financial. We notice there's no invoice because this is the particular reversal or the correction. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the hold, approve that correction for that decrease of 90,000, and go ahead and release that invoice. Now, as part of that pro forma release, it's going through and doing the reversal of the original accounts receivable invoice, going through and applying the credit for the 8,000 or 8,000 plus of the amount changed for the finishes line item, and that will do that information for me automatically upon release. We can see now back at that project invoice history where the original invoice for $516,000 was now credited with that $516,000 credit memo, and the new invoice is open and ready to go for $508,000. So the automation has created the credit memo to the original pro forma invoice, and now the new pro forma invoice for the adjusted amount or the corrected amount for $508,000 is ready to be processed. To recap what we did with 24R1, well, the generation of the new accounts receivable invoice that was corrected remains the same, as does the reversing of the accounts receivable credit memo. But now we automatically release the reversing accounts receivable credit memo and auto reverse the AR invoice. That functionality is new with this release, and then will very much help you streamline the workflow of those corrections. Let's review compliance. If you think about compliance management, you're receiving documents, maybe it's insurance certificates, lien waivers, safety training documentation, that needs to be recorded and collected inside of the software. While you might have examples of the same policy that needs to be across multiple entities, maybe the same subcontractors working on multiple projects, and the one policy covers them across project. Now, you also need the ability to update that information and be specific for the policy. Prior to 24R1, if a vendor was working on multiple projects, you were not able to assign the same policy number with that vendor to multiple projects. You had to make something unique. Same would be true if that same policy or single policy covered multiple clients' categories. Maybe in this case, you can see insurance policies from liability, automotive, and umbrella. Well, in 24R1, we've lifted some of the limitations of the prior compliance checking so that you can enter the same policy number across multiple projects for that same vendor, as you see here within the green items and that are going through, as well as now that same policy number can be represented across multiple entities. So looking at the uniqueness by category, policy, vendor, project, effective date, and limitations, and streamlining the compliance management available inside of Acumatica. If we look at other things that we've done to help with usability regarding project transaction, currency, when you have multiple currency transactions, previously the currency defaulted from the tenant and was not updated with the specific branch or project currency. That led to discrepancies and some confusion over to where correct currency should be coming from. So with 24R1, we now default the currency ID to the project transaction based on the branch-based currency. And so that we can go back and look at existing transaction, it's going to review and not automatically change that for existing transactions. This will be going ahead and move forward. We've also enhanced the mobile experience. As we look at their mobile application on the Acumatica app and what gets displayed there when you were looking at projects, project tasks, maybe the cost code and the description. Before 2024 R1, you had a description in the code and you could see on the screen where things were bolded and what stood out. Well, with 24R1, we've now enhanced the visibility and the usability in different lookups and information presented on the mobile device. And this was based specifically on feedback from customers and partners like yourselves. So now we can unify the project, the task, the cost code selections on the mobile device, make more fields searchable, and then have things be the individual code itself and then the description. So much more usable on the mobile device as we look at things like subcontracts or purchase orders or employee time cards. Well, those are some of the things that we've done on the construction side. Now let's move into field service.
Welcome. We appreciate you sharing time with us as we review the changes made in Release 2024 R1. I am Cindy Whitner, Senior Product Manager for Field Services. The Field Services modules of Acumatica focus on the workflow and processes needed by companies that provide services to others. These services are usually short in duration, taking a few hours to a few weeks, or maybe a very precise task or service that requires a quick resolution and billing process. The main module is focused on service work management. This includes receiving the request for work and the creation of a service order to record what needs to be done. An appointment is scheduled and assigned to a technician. The technician performs the work identified and captures the labor and materials used to complete the work. Then the work is reviewed and billed to the customer. There are two modules providing features for a service company. Service management, which provides the work management areas that includes service orders, appointments, tracking schedules on the calendar, and a mobile component for technicians in the field. For those who need to manage the equipment they service or provide service agreements, the equipment management module provides the tools to create equipment, create and bill service contracts, and create maintenance schedules that will end up being a service order or appointment for scheduling of the work. The modules are tied to accounting when creating an accounts receivable invoice and general ledger transactions. There are also direct links to creating purchase orders, inventory issues, time activities, and expense claims. In 24R1, we made changes to the process of correcting sales order invoices to improve the usability of this workflow. Now, hopefully correcting an invoice is the exception, not the rule. When this happens, the process needs to be easy and straightforward. Pre-2024 R1, exact steps needed to be followed, and if not, issues would arise with postings to the general ledger, accounts receivable, inventory, and field services. The problem was we required several manual steps on the part of the user to complete the correction properly. This diagram illustrates the current correction process needed to reopen the field services document to make changes and then re-invoice. Where could a user go wrong? First, the credit memo needs to be created manually. Then, the selection of the invoice and all the detail lines was also done manually. You had to find the invoice and select all the lines. And finally, once the credit memo was created, it needed to be manually applied to the invoice. In 2024 R1, we have streamlined the process by adding a new action in the sales order invoice form, reverse service invoices. This process will automatically create the credit memo with the correct selection of lines, automatically apply the credit memo to the invoice. We still reverse the original inventory issue transaction to credit and increase the quantities on hand. And this then allows the service document to be reopened, corrections made, and billing run again to create the new invoice. Let's see how this works. For our demo, we have completed some emergency work at the Chocolate by Design facility. We invoiced the customer, but received a call that we invoiced them for filters that they had on site. We confirmed with the technician, and indeed we did charge them for filters they provided. So we need to correct the invoice, make that change, and generate a new invoice. Here's the appointment we billed. You can see by our details we billed for a service and some material items. And if we go to our billing documents, we can see we created an SO invoice, and here's the invoice number. We'll click on this hyperlink that will open the invoice form. Once the invoice is open, you can see I have the same three detail lines. I'm going to click on our Actions menu and select Reverse Service Invoice. You can see that it's automatically created the credit memo, pulled in all the detail lines, and all I have to do at this point is click Release. Once the action is completed, my credit memo is released and it has automatically been applied to the invoice. If I close this and now come back to my appointment, you'll see I also have recorded that credit memo transaction against the invoice as well, and it gives me the option to unclose and make my changes and then run billing. The inventory issue for the credit has also been made, so these two filters have now been added back into my quantity on hand. In summary, the reverse service invoice action automatically creates the credit memo, automatically applies the credit memo to the invoice, reverses the inventory issue entry, creating a credit transaction, and allows the appointment to be reopened for adjustment and rebilling. This process also applies if you are generating the invoices via the service order as opposed to the appointment. Thank you so much for your attention. We appreciate your time and being a customer of Acumatica.
So to recap today, we saw some things from 24R1 regarding construction and pro forma expense linking, negative receipt for corporate cards, simplified corrections from a pro forma and compliance standpoint, and then we looked at some things in field service and how to simplify the credit memo creation for service invoices. Overall, you've seen expanded and enhanced functionality and additional usability. Please review the release notes, and we thank you very much.